Yeah, on behalf of Tablets India, I welcome you formally to this web talk. We are just going to initiate the session. We are just going to start. It's 4 o'clock dot in my watch, and we are going to start. First and foremost, I would like to say namaste, namaskar, and vanakkam to each one of you. Right, in the era of social distancing, I think this is the best possible option that we can have, and we can greet each other in this way. Now, for the last so many days, when we all were at home, those who are kids at home, I'm sure these pictures are also known to all of us. Superhero, we all know, is having the supernatural power, who is dedicated to fight the evil of the universe, protect the public, and battle the supervillains. Now, in the fight against COVID, doctors, you are the real superhero, and that's why from Tablets India, we thank you, all the doctors. Thank you very much for protecting all of us. Uh, in fact, before we proceed, I would like to share one information on one story with you that at Tablets India, we have been distributing 1100 freshly cooked food packets every day to the people who are under the below poverty line and who lost their daily wages in the first lockdown. And this is in collaboration with our Annadhanam Center, which is located at Tondiarpet, Chennai. In fact, most of the local newspaper, you can see some of the clippings available here. Most of the newspapers, the paper cutting has also been has come, which I have put it here. Doctors and the most of the viewers who have come over here today, Tablets India takes pride in organizing this web talk. The topic of today's evening is nutrition in preterm neonates, and it's a current best practices, a case-based discussion. And today we are absolutely privileged to welcome Madam Dr. C. Aparna, right, who is the MD and DM Neonatology. She is the director of NICU Ankura Group of Hospitals for Women and Children, which is based at Hyderabad. Madam, welcome for the welcome to the web talk. Now, if for the benefit of the audience, Madam has done her MD from PGI Chandigarh. She has completed her DM Neonatology from AIMS, New Delhi. She is the editor of IJPP and made the neonatal protocol over there. She has authored more than nearly 20 book chapters, examiner of the neonatal fellowship examination, reviewer of the Indian and the international journals, and more than 20 publications in the peer-reviewed journal. Viewers, while we welcome Dr. C. Aparna, I would like to state one sentence which is there in the next slide. Madam had said that I would like to make the session more interactive. So, time to time, I would like to know the opinion of the audience. Polling will be conducted and summary will be flashed on the screen. Now, for the benefit of the audience, what is the procedure that I would like to tell you? The polling during the presentation, for that, if you take a look at the bottom of your screen, there is one icon. There is one icon which is the polling icon. If you click on that, you can register your poll within the 30 seconds, and the result of the poll also will be flashed. Right? So with that, I would not waste time. I would hand over the floor to Madam. Madam, welcome. I will stop my sharing. You can put your sharing, and the floor is open to you, Madam.
So, thank you very much to Tablets India and to Mr. Sandeep Kar in particular.
Thank you, Madam.
So it's a great opportunity to be interacting with the neonatal community from across the country to share our experiences and the current best evidence-based practices in nutrition of preterm neonates. So we all know that nutrition is a very important and often neglected area, I would say, in the care of neonates. And but we also realize that this is a very important aspect or facet of care. So over the next 40 minutes or so, I would like to discuss regarding why nutrition is important, what would be the goals of optimal nutrition in preterm neonates, what to feed, how to feed, and when to feed. We will be discussing this with relevant evidence. We should also be discussing a little bit about the assessment of feeding intolerance and how to manage feeding intolerance. And before we wind up, we will be discussing the evidence and the practical aspects of human milk fortification and a little bit about probiotics as well. A disclaimer before I begin. Nutrition, first of all, is a very vast topic and it is almost impossible to compress it entirely within a 40-minute talk. So this talk will be essentially about enteral nutrition, and we would not be touching upon parenteral nutrition. And it would be mostly about the pertinent practical aspects of our day-to-day practice when it comes to enteral nutrition. So this is something which most of the audience are already well aware of. We know why optimal nutrition is so important, especially when we take care of preterm neonates. Optimal nutrition is associated with protection from infections, late onset sepsis, avoidance of osteopenia or metabolic bone disease, a trend towards lesser retinopathy of prematurity, and is associated with earlier discharge. Not only are short-term effects seen with optimal nutrition, but it has a very long-term implication in terms of better subsequent growth, better neurological outcomes, or on the other hand, neonates with suboptimal in-hospital nutrition are at highest risk of abnormal neurological outcomes. And overzealous or postnatal overnutrition is linked with adult onset obesity, coronary artery disease, and stroke. And we have all heard and read about the Barker's hypothesis or fetal onset of adult disorders. So babies who are born growth restricted and who are exposed to postnatal overnutrition are found to be at high risk of developing metabolic syndrome subsequently. So all this basically speaks about the importance of achieving optimal nutrition during the in-hospital phase or after discharge and beyond. This very elegant study, which has been often quoted, which has come from the NICHT network of the United States, has in fact shown very nicely and clearly that poor in-hospital growth, which was defined as 12 grams per kg per day of growth before until discharge, was associated with 55% risk of abnormal neurodevelopmental outcomes at 18 months when compared to the neonates who grew rapidly, which was defined as 21 grams per kg per day, wherein the risk of abnormal NDI was only 29%. So we can see that even after adjusting for all other potential confounding factors like the degree of sickness and the degree of immaturity, merely having slow in-hospital growth increased the risk of having abnormal neurodevelopmental outcomes by nearly 2 times. But we also know that there are a number of challenges in meeting optimal nutrition, beginning with the fact that preterm neonates are born with limited nutritional reserve, have immature metabolic pathways to handle glucose, protein, such as immaturity in the enzymes responsible for glycogenolysis, gluconeogenesis, etc. They physiologically have increased nutrient demands due to sickness, insensible water losses, and catabolism. Neonates with bronchopulmonary dysplasia also have increased nutrient demands. They are at higher risk of medical and surgical problems such as necrotizing enterocolitis. And most importantly, they have been compromised or deprived of the most rapid phase of intrauterine growth, which is between 23 to 27 weeks of gestation, during which a newborn, a fetus, would generally gain weight at the rate of 21 grams per kg per day or 15 grams per day. So a newborn who is born preterm is compromised of this most vital phase of in-uterine growth. Also, after a baby is born preterm, we have a lot of practical challenges, be it with providing optimal parenteral or enteral nutrition, such as non-availability of parenteral nutrition solutions, cost, difficulty in achieving vascular access, fear of infections, and when it comes to enteral nutrition, we are going to discuss about the need for having standardized practices or enteral nutrition guidelines, and variability in practices itself is a very important factor for suboptimal nutrition, unavailability of mother's own milk or breast milk, use of unfortified milk, not having guidelines or policies on managing feeding intolerance, and many others. So in effect, the principle of optimal nutrition should be to try and achieve full enteral feeding at the earliest in order to avoid sepsis and vascular catheter related complications. At the same time, providing optimal macro and micronutrients, and also at the same time remembering that we should avoid the adverse effects of overzealously rapid feeding culminating in necrotizing enterocolitis. So optimal nutrition therefore lies in achieving this close balance between overzealous rapid feeding with a higher risk of NEC vis-a-vis a very conservative feeding policy which might put the baby at risk of central line associated infections and suboptimal macro and micronutrient intakes. And both these have important implications on long-term growth as well as neurological disability. The most important point here is to note that having a standardized feeding policy itself, as observed in this meta-analysis of 15 observational studies published by Dr. Sanjay Patole and his group, was associated with a significant decrease in the risk of NEC. As you can see, this is the forest plot of the relative risks for NEC, and you can see that the point estimates of risk for developing NEC in all the individual studies were well to the left of the line of equivalence, favoring that standard feeding guidelines are associated with significantly lower risk of NEC, the pooled relative risk being 0.22, which means a 78% lesser risk of NEC with just having a standardized feeding policy. So let us discuss some aspects of what a standard feeding policy should look like. We will begin with a case scenario. So say we have a preterm neonate, 26 plus 3 weeks of gestational age with a birth weight of 700 grams, delivered in your unit, currently is 2 hours old. The mother has been covered with a full course of antenatal steroids and there are no risk factors for sepsis. She delivered with preterm vaginal delivery. The baby received 1 dose of surfactant by Ensure because of increased FiO2 requirement and is currently on nasal CPAP with FiO2 of 24% and PEEP of 5. You are currently giving 10% dextrose through an umbilical venous catheter. So quickly, we open the first poll for the day. We have 4 options in front of you regarding enteral feeding. Let us ask the participants, and I kindly request all of you to take up the poll question 1 in front of you and choose whichever option would be best in your opinion. 1, don't start enteral feeding, parenteral nutrition is enough for a few days. Option 2, wait for the baby to stabilize and start feeding within 24 hours of age. Option 3, talk to mother antenatally about expressing milk when possible and start feeds as soon as possible. And option 4, there is no need to worry about enteral feeding now. So let's keep the poll open for 30 seconds. So I request you all to quickly fill in or choose whatever in your opinion would be the best thing to start. And we would be able to consolidate what the whole group thinks, because we will be quickly able to see which is the most popular option amongst all the audience. So we have another 20 seconds to go. I hope you're all polling in your options.
50% have already made their indications.
Okay, so this is all about discussion and sharing of experiences and information. And I do agree that in many of the questions, there may not be a single best answer, and we are just trying to see what is possibly the current best thing to do. So are we good to go?
Yeah, we can end. I'm ending the poll. Okay. And I am flashing the result.
Right. So I'm not sure if everyone can see the results, but I'm able to see that among the 49 participants who have voted, 63% have gone for option 3. That seems to be the most popular option, which is talk to the mother antenatally about expressing milk when possible and start feeds as early as possible. Only 6% have gone for both option 1 as well as 4, and the remaining 35% have gone for option 2. So I agree with the majority of you. So thank you, Mr. Kar. We can close the first poll.
Yeah.
And thank you, participants, for your participating in the poll. So as most of you have rightly opined, early trophic feeding, which is providing less than 25% of the total volume of enteral feeding, usually by 10 to 25 ml per kg per day, not only accelerates gastrointestinal maturity, endocrine and hormonal maturity, it also improves tolerance to subsequent feeding and motivates mothers to keep milk expression on consistently. This is something which has been consistently shown to not increase the risk of NEC, as also evidenced in the most updated Cochrane review on trophic feeding, which was published in 2013. The relative risk for developing NEC among neonates who received trophic feeding versus no trophic feeding was 1.07, and the 95% confidence intervals were 0.67 to 1.7, which means they were lying on either side of the line of equivalent increase in NEC with minimal enteral nutrition. And in fact, there was a trend towards lesser duration of time to reach full feeding by 1.05 days lesser. So if we are able to start minimal enteral nutrition within the first 24 hours or as early as possible, we are going to reach full feeding earlier by at least a day. And this is something very encouraging. And the point that is also to be noted here is efforts to start enteral nutrition begin right from the antenatal period, and one has to take this into consideration by talking to mothers about early expression of milk, especially mothers of imminent preterm deliveries. And the breast milk pump is one of the earliest and the most important prescriptions to be given to the family of a VLBW neonate. And please make it a point to include this in the first counseling that you provide to this family. I would like to also allude to some conditions which are not true contraindications for trophic feeding, but often are cited as reasons to not feed babies enterally. And these include neonates with asphyxia, neonates with respiratory distress syndrome who are stable on mechanical ventilation or CPAP are not contraindications for minimal enteral nutrition. The presence of an indwelling umbilical arterial or venous line, therapy with indomethacin, or hypotension, as long as hypotension is not worsening or it is not requiring progressively increasing doses of inotropes, are not contraindications for minimal enteral nutrition. Also, we must reserve the use of this term minimal enteral nutrition for only the most immature neonates, and we will be discussing where comes the role of early complete feeding as well further in this discussion. So essentially, remember that this term should be reserved for extremely premature neonates born at gestational ages less than or equal to 28 weeks of gestational age. The only contraindications, if at all, for minimal enteral nutrition would be the presence of suspected or confirmed intestinal obstruction. Say, for instance, you have an antenatally diagnosed case of intestinal atresia or a neonate with ileus. And you might put neonates with umbilical Doppler abnormalities as relative contraindications, but this again will warrant some further discussion, which we will do subsequently. Some golden rules with trophic feeding. One should start trophic feeding as early as possible, preferably within the first 24 hours of life in every neonate, and this can be started much more earlier in the more mature neonates, say above 30 weeks of gestational age. Exercise caution in extremely preterm neonates and ELBW neonates. If by 24 to 48 hours, no maternal or donor milk is still available, then you might consider formula milk also as a route, as a choice for starting minimal enteral nutrition. So this is just to emphasize that the unavailability of mother's own milk or donor human milk should not in isolation deter us from starting any minimal enteral nutrition, provided every effort has not been taken. I mean, every effort should be taken to procure human milk, but still if it is unavailable by 24 to 48 hours, even beginning formula milk might be more advantageous than keeping the baby on enteral fasting. So with that, we move on to the next facet of enteral nutrition, which would be the mode of feeding and continuous versus bolus feeding. So with this, I request Mr. Kar to open the second poll. So you are starting MEN for the same neonate, this 26-weeker. At 6 hours of age, you have decided to start minimal enteral nutrition, and you have procured, say, mother's milk. What is the mode of feeding that you would prefer? Would you want to feed this baby with NG, nasogastric intermittent bolus feeding, or with the OG tube? Would you want to do NG, continuous feeding, or continuous feeding with the OG tube? So let's take 20 seconds for this poll. May I request all of you to kindly choose whatever in your opinion would be the best thing to do. So is it NG bolus feeding, which means like 2 hourly or 3 hourly feeding, OG bolus feeding, NG continuous infusion feeding, OG continuous infusion feeding? I hope everyone is able to see and take up the poll.
Yeah, madam. I think 52% have already voted.
So this is again something which we are all commonly encountering. I know that some units routinely practice nasogastric feeding and some units have the practice of orogastric feeding.
So, madam, I'm ending the poll.
Yes.
Yeah, and I publish the results.
Okay, so here we have almost 28% of the audience have opted for continuous feeding and an equal proportion have gone for NG versus OG. And we have the remaining almost 70% of the participants have polled for bolus feeding, and most of them, 48%, have gone for orogastric bolus feeding. So I see that there is a little bit of division of opinion here as compared to the first question. And yes, in my personal view, definitely bolus feeding is advantageous over continuous infusion feeding, and orogastric feeding has some physiological benefits over nasogastric feeding. So we will close poll 2 and we will move on to the discussion. Right. So we all know that the initial mode of feeding is determined by the gestational maturity of the neonate. So in most neonates born at less than or equal to 28 weeks of gestational age, the neonates have practically no or minimal sucking efforts with poor gut motility, and these are neonates candidates for parenteral nutrition. Between 29 to 31 weeks, there are sucking bursts, but there is still not much of coordination between suck, swallow, and breathing. And these neonates are candidates for gavach feeding. But mind you that there are individual variations, and a proportion of neonates in this gestational age range may be able to take some oral feeding. 32 to 34 week neonates who are otherwise stable, clinically stable, have mature sucking efforts, and they have fairly better coordination between swallowing and breathing, and these neonates are candidates for beginning oral feeding straight away with a cup, a palada, or a spoon based on the unit's practice, or a nifty cup which some of you might be using. Neonates born at maturity more than 34 weeks of gestational age should be straight away begun on breastfeeding. And remember that the babies who are fed by mouth or neonates who are eligible for breastfeeding directly are those candidates for ad libitum feeding, which means both the frequency and the quantity of feeding is determined by the neonate's feeding or hunger cues. Now, a more practical approach would be that you should try every clinically stable, hemodynamically stable neonate more than 34 weeks of gestational age should be initiated on breastfeeding. Of course, one should carefully observe for the effectiveness of sucking and the duration of breastfeeding and for the adequacy of breastfeeding as determined by the trend of weight gain, urine output, etc. And we continue breastfeeding if we are happy with the adequacy of feeding. And if not, some of these neonates may have to be helped with additional oral feeding in the form of spoon, cup, or palada. A neonate born between 32 to 34 weeks, straight away when stable, is eligible for this mode of feeding by oral route, and one should observe if the neonate is swallowing adequate quantity of feeding. Say for instance, a 33-weeker who may be clinically stable is repeatedly spilling or coughing more than 50% of the feed volume may need to be helped with orogastric or nasogastric feeding. And if the neonate is able to accept this well, then we continue the baby on oral feeding. And as we discussed, most neonates born between 29 to 31 weeks would have to be begun on gavach feeding as the initial mode of feeding. And then subsequently, there are various scoring systems and clinical assessment tool to assess the readiness for oral feeding. And it is also determined by the physiological and respiratory stability. So this explains the mode of feeding. Now, when it comes to nasogastric versus orogastric tubes, there are few observational studies which have shown that the use of nasogastric tubes is associated with increased nasal impedance or resistance, especially when the NG tube is inserted through the bigger nostril, and hence orogastric tubes may be physiologically more adept for the respiratory status and maintaining the respiratory comfort of the neonate when compared to the feeding with NG tubes. And also orogastric tubes are practically easier to insert, but the only limitation is that they get frequently dislodged when compared to NG tubes, and this may end up increasing the cost which may be a problem in very busy public sector hospitals. So one can conclude that orogastric tubes are more physiological, although this evidence is only from observational studies, but the choice is entirely on the nurses and their comfort level. So this is something that is welcome for discussion. I mean, the clinicians need to discuss with their nurses whichever they are more comfortable. In our unit, we are more comfortable with orogastric tube feeds. Now, when it comes to continuous versus intermittent feeding, so there is a Cochrane review with 4 to 5 randomized controlled trials, if I'm right, and they have shown that the use of continuous infusion feeding is associated with absolutely no difference in the incidence of necrotizing enterocolitis and the duration of days to regain birth weight as well as the time to reach full feeding. So do not practice continuous infusion feeding as a matter of routine. It does not offer any advantage over intermittent bolus feeding, which is more physiological, and on the contrary is associated with some adverse effects such as risk of contamination, loss of nutrient content because the fat content of milk tends to stick to the infusion tubes. It is more labor intensive, cost intensive. It requires constant checking of the position of the feeding tube, and therefore there is absolutely no rationale to use it as a routine mode of feeding. So given these 4 options, the best option probably to choose based on physiological basis and based on current evidence would be to go for intermittent feeding with the orogastric tube. We now move on to the next question, probably the least controversial of all questions in preterm enteral nutrition, which is the best milk to start with. So the WHO's low birth weight feeding guidelines, as well as the more recently published NNF guidelines, clinical practice guidelines, endorse that mother's own milk is the best milk for a preterm neonate, followed by donor expressed breast milk, but in settings where there is access to appropriate milk banking facility. And then this is followed by formula milk, either preterm infant formula or standard infant formula. Now, preterm infant formula may be associated with better short-term anthropometric parameters like better in-hospital weight gain, length gain, etc., but is not associated with any significant long-term benefit, because of which the WHO guidelines endorses that if a preterm neonate is unable to get both mother's own milk or donor human milk, you may feed with a standard or a term formula rather than a preterm or enriched formula. Right? So we move on to the next question here, and this is the third poll for the audience. So what milk are you going to start in this baby, the same baby whom we are discussing, the 26-weeker? So option 1, we can throw the poll open, Mr. Sandeep. Option 1 is mother's own milk, even if that takes 3 days. Mother's own milk or donor EBM if mother's milk is unavailable. Third option is mother's milk or donor EBM or preterm formula. So you choose whatever is available when EBM is unavailable, or would you choose to give only human milk, mother's own milk or donor milk for the first 24 hours, and if not available after 24 hours, then you would opt for donor milk or preterm formula. So would you wait for 3 days because mother's own milk is not there, or would you prefer to start with human milk as early as possible? So I hope all the audience are going for the poll.
Yeah, the polling is on, madam.
So we'll probably try and stick to maybe 15 seconds for want of. Okay, so can we have the responses?
Yeah, I will just show you in a minute. Yeah, I'm ending the poll, though the participants are responding still. Okay. Yeah, I end the poll and I share the result, madam.
Okay. So we have 53 responses, and the participants are equally divided between option 3 and option 4. So which means nearly 34% have gone for option 3. So you would like to start MOM or donor human milk or preterm formula. And option 4 is start only with human milk in the first 24 hours. And if human milk is still unavailable after 24 hours, you can start with preterm formula. Okay, so thank you for voting, and I will come back, I'll summarize and then probably come back with what in my judgment. I mean, option 3 and 4 are equally, appropriate options. So we all uniformly agree that mother's own milk is the best milk, and we all know that there is evidence that mother's own milk when compared to formula milk was associated with lesser mortality by 18%, lower incidence of infections and necrotizing enterocolitis by 60%, improve neurodevelopmental scores by as much as 5.2 better points in MDI scores in the long term, and donor human milk also was associated with 61% lesser incidence of severe infections and NEC. So we can see that obviously the risk of morbidity, infections, NEC, and mortality are lesser with the use of human milk, and use of mother's own milk in particular is associated with numerous immunological and biological positive effects, and this, that is the proportion of VLBW neonates in your unit who are getting 100% mother's own milk must be a quality indicator. And this is an idea which we got inspired from our colleagues at Fernandez Hospital from Murki sir's work on a QA project and in improving MOM usage, and this is something that we have routinely adapted in our unit. Every day in the dashboard we enter the proportion of babies who are getting 100% MOM. So obviously mother's own milk is the best, but the question here is, how long can we wait on for starting minimal enteral nutrition when MOM is not available? And based on two small studies, the guideline published in Nutrients 2015 by Saurabh Datta sir's group recommends that if by 24 to 48 hours of postnatal age, mother's own milk is still unavailable, then one could start with preterm formula at least in order to avoid the complications of prolonged use of intravenous lines and central catheters. So with this in mind, it looks like you start with human milk, preferably in the first 24 hours. And if for some reason you still are unable to get human milk beyond 24 hours, it might actually be better to start preterm formula when compared to continuing parenteral nutrition with enteral fasting. So we go for option 4, but option 3, as I already told you, is not strongly disproven by evidence as well. So I would take option 3 also as equally valid. Now we have understood that minimal enteral nutrition is safe and should be begin as early as possible in every clinically stable preterm neonate. We have discussed the mode of initial feeding, which is determined by gestational maturity, and we have also discussed which is the best milk to start. Now let us discuss, after beginning minimal enteral nutrition and seeing that the baby is tolerating, how are we going to advance enteral feeding? So now the baby we are discussing is 40 hours old. So we open the poll 4. Baby has been on 10 ml per kg per day of enteral feeding. And what is your plan for advancing enteral feeding? So we have 4 options in front of you. So I request Mr. Kar to open poll 4. And I request all the participants to quickly vote for what in your opinion is the best thing to do. Option 1, you wouldn't touch the enteral nutrition volume. So would you let 10 ml per kg per day go for another 24 hours? Would you increase by not more than 5 ml per kg per day? So are you going to be conservative and increase 10 to 15, 15 to 20 ml per kg per day every 24 hours? Or are you going to be more aggressive and go up by 30 ml per kg per day? Or do you just want to go up to full feeds in one day? I think none would go for option 4. But let us see how many of you like 5 versus 30 versus no increments. So another 10 seconds to go. And we have some interesting studies coming in this segment on advancement of enteral feeding, slow versus rapid. So
yeah, madam, I end the poll and I share the results.
Okay. So the majority, 54% of you are in view of increasing feeding by not more than 5 ml per kg per day, which is option 2. And 38%, that is 23 out of 61 participants have voted for option 3, which is 30 ml per kg per day. And I'll tell you why one of these options is the best option. So let me go to the discussion first. So let's conclude the poll, Mr. Kar. Okay, so first, let us discuss the most updated evidence from the recent Cochrane, which has been updated in 2017, and then we will discuss SIFT, which is this trial which has contributed maximum weight to this Cochrane review. So the Cochrane review, which compared early versus slow versus rapid advancement of enteral feeding, defines slow as an increment of 15 to 20 ml per kg per day, and rapid as advancement of enteral feeding volume by 30 to 40 ml per kg per day. And this Cochrane review, which currently has 10 trials and more than 3,000 neonates randomized, has shown that there is absolutely no difference in NEC by advancing feeding at the rate of 30 to 40 ml per kg per day. And in fact, neonates in the slow feeding group took significantly longer time to regain birth weight by 2 to 6 days. So they took 2 to 6 days longer to reach birth weight. They took longer time to establish full enteral feeding by 1 to 5 days, and they were associated, or they were at risk of higher risk of invasive infection by 15% with a relative risk of 1.15. And you can see that both the arms of the 95% confidence interval point towards a higher risk of invasive infection. Now, I will discuss the most important trial in this Cochrane, which was a SIFT trial, which was recently published in NEJM in the year 2019, a multicentric trial which included a large number of neonates, almost 3,000 neonates, and was precisely 2,800 neonates, and compared advancement in feeding by 18 ml per kg per day vis-a-vis 30 ml per kg per day. So this was the speed and increment of feeding trial. And let us see what the results were. The primary outcome of this trial was the long-term neurological outcome at 24 months of corrected age, in which the investigators did not find any significant difference. But more interestingly, look at the secondary outcomes here. So necrotizing enterocolitis, more than or equal to stage 2, 5% in the fasted increment group, 5.6% in the slower increment group. So there was absolutely no difference in NEC. It was nearly 5 to 6% in both the groups. Whereas the median time to reach full feeding volume, which was at least 150 ml per kg per day of enteral feeding, was only 7 days in the fast increment group, vis-a-vis 10 days in the slow increment group. So neonates in the rapid increment group could reach full feeding 3 days earlier. And they also had lesser number of parenteral nutrition days during the hospital stay, from 11 days in the slow feeding group to 9 days in the fast feeding group. So you can appreciate that the advancement of feeding by 30 ml per kg per day was absolutely not associated with an increase in risk of NEC, was in fact associated with lesser time to reach full feeding and lesser parenteral nutrition days, which are very, very important outcomes in low middle income countries like ours. The most important aspect was that the SIFT trial included a substantial number of high-risk neonates, which included neonates born below 1,000 grams and neonates born less than 28 weeks of gestational age. So extremely preterm neonates and ELBW neonates accounted for almost 35% of the study population. So the previous Cochrane reviews on this comparison used to conclude that we still do not have enough evidence to conclude that rapid increments are safe in ELBW neonates, and we no longer have to worry about that. The SIFT trial had nearly 1/3 representation of ELBW and extremely low birth weight neonates, and the study results were by far the same even in that subgroup. And they also included nearly 1/5 population of neonates with antenatally diagnosed Doppler abnormalities. So essentially what this does say is that we are able to safely increase feeding even in the high risk populations, that is ELBW neonates, neonates born below 28 weeks, and neonates with umbilical Doppler abnormalities by enteral volumes of 30 ml per kg per day increments, and it is as safe as lower increments. The only difference, if at all, might be that neonates who are fed exclusively with formula milk, we do not have enough data to say that rapid increments are safe. And this, of course, should be a very small proportion of our population. And we must target and aim that most of our neonates are on human milk. And as long as they are on human milk, it is safe to advance feeding by 30 ml per kg per day. Now, we have a very interesting and important Indian study, which was performed in Lady Hardinge Medical College by Sushma Nangia ma'am and her group, where they went one step further. And what they did was to start full or complete enteral nutrition in stable preterm neonates born between 28 to 34 weeks or between 1,000 to 1,500 grams birth weight, who did not have any other clinical instability or umbilical Doppler abnormalities. So they chose a relatively mature group of preterm neonates more than 28 weeks of gestational age. And you can see that they randomized neonates to early total enteral feeding, where full feeding, that is 80 ml per kg per day, was straight away begin as enteral feeding, versus conventional enteral feeding group, where the baby was begun on some IV fluids and begin with minimal enteral nutrition at 20 ml per kg per day and augmented step by step by 20 ml per kg per day. So what they found was actually very, very encouraging. And in fact, the time to reach full feeds was shorter in the early total enteral feeding group as expected. And also, as you can appreciate, the incidence of other morbidities like feeding intolerance, the incidence of clinical sepsis as well as culture positive sepsis was much lower in the early total enteral feeding. And in fact, a very encouraging another finding of the study was even the incidence of confirmed necrotizing enterocolitis, stage 2 and above, was markedly lesser, 1.1% in the early total enteral feeding group, vis-a-vis nearly 6% in the conventional enteral feeding group. So what it does show is that, of course, more and more data and larger number of neonates may have to be randomized or recruited in studies comparing early total enteral feeding. But it is definitely safe to begin complete enteral feeding in a majority of stable neonates who are born at gestational ages above 28 weeks of gestational age. And this is something which probably will have very, very important implications in countries like ours, where the longer use of IV lines is associated with larger or higher risk of late onset sepsis. So the answer to the poll 4 is to increase by 30 ml per kg per day, and I hope that the audience is convinced with this answer from the data from SIFT and from our own Indian data. So some points to note when we are advancing enteral feeding would be that you choose a whole number which would be convenient for nurses to administer feeding. For instance, if you calculate 50 ml per kg per day for a neonate of 1000 grams birth weight and you're dividing it into 12 feeds, you would probably not give a volume like 4.2 or 4.3 and you round it up to the nearest whole number. Remember that fluid rate should be decreased immediately when enteral feeding is being increased, and if trophic feeding is delayed for some reason, one should not try and make up for the time lag in nutritional feeding, and we should always stick to the standard feeding regimen as we discussed. I will keep kind of skip through this part on frequency of feeding, and I think we will straight away go to the poll here, which is poll 5. So now we are discussing another aspect of feeding. So this neonate we are discussing is now 72 hours old, is on 50 ml per kg per day. How will you prefer to give enteral feeding? So please open the poll, Mr. Sandeepkar. So would you want to give one hourly feeding with NG or OG tube? Would you want to give 2 hourly feeding with either a NG or a OG tube? Continuous feeding, I think we already discussed this, and I hope most of you wouldn't choose this. And the last one would be bolus feeding given 4 hours apart. So we have 10 seconds, and let us see what the participants would prefer the most among these three approaches. And then we will discuss about some evidence on frequency of feeding. So can we wrap it up?
Yeah, here the response was faster.
Okay. So it was a small question. Okay. So here we have a very clear verdict. 93% of the participants have opted for 2 hourly feeding. So thank you, Mr. Kar. We'll close this poll. So I agree with all of you here. And so when it comes to the frequency of feeding, again, we have a lot of observational studies. So I am showing here results from one such observational study by Rudinger and his group, which was published in 2008. And when they compared 2 hourly versus 3 hourly feeding, of course, this was only an observational study and not randomized control trial. There was a trend towards longer duration of CPAP in the 3 hourly feeding group, probably because of the increased feeding volume leading to distended abdomen, probably compromising on the respiratory mechanics. And there was a very unexpected trend towards longer duration of phototherapy. However, the clinical significance of this outcome can be debated. So essentially, you can say that this is not very strong evidence to recommend 2 hourly feeding over 3 hourly feeding. Some physiological benefits seem to be there, especially in the neonates born at less than 1250 grams when fed 2 hourly versus 3 hourly, particularly a trend for lesser apneas and lesser duration of CPAP, probably because of keeping the feeding volumes on the lower end, and which may probably have less effect on the lung respiratory mechanics, compliance, etc. But please note that the randomized control trials which have compared 2 versus longer duration of gap between feedings, such as 3 or even 6 hourly feedings, have not really shown any hard differences in the outcomes. And hence, this is again something which must be determined by the unit's own nurses and the level of comfort, the level of work that they are having in a very busy unit. 3-hourly feeding, especially in neonates about 1200 or 1250 grams who are still on tube feeding, of course. Most of the neonates shouldn't be neonates with sickness or maybe bronchopulmonary dysplasia who are still on tube feeding. You may have some advantage of giving feeding 3-hourly because it results in lesser nursing work and time. But in neonates who are smaller, maybe there are some physiological benefits with 2-hourly feeding, but there is no hard evidence from randomized controlled trials here. So to conclude, a tentative feeding regimen might look something like this. This is just an attempt. So one should start MEN or minimal enteral nutrition as early as possible, and at least by 24 hours in even among neonates born less than 28 weeks and less than 1000 grams. We generally start MEN volumes of 10 to 15 ml per kg per day in the neonates less than 1000 grams, and this can be 20 to 30 ml per kg in the larger neonates. And we just discussed the study from India where some of these neonates more than 28 or 30 weeks may be candidates straight away for complete total enteral feeding, and the concept of MEN itself is obsolete here. Now, progressive enteral feeding should be begun between 24 to 48 hours of postnatal age of tolerance to MEN, and this should be incremented at the rate of 30 ml per kg per day as per the SIF trial. And frequency of feeding, except for the very small neonates, say neonates less than 1000, 1250 grams, most neonates can be fed easily, equally well with 2 or 3 hourly feeding regimen. And with all these, we ultimately try and reach full feeding by at least 14 days, even in babies below 1000 grams, by 10 to 14 days, and it should be much more earlier in babies born between 1000 to 1500 grams. And this is like the maximum number for us to reach full feeding. And of course, every attempt should be done to reach full feeding earlier than this. I think we are running behind time. How much more time do we have, Mr. Sandeep? I think
we can continue, no problem.
Okay. So we will now discuss another very important aspect of preterm nutrition, which is feeding intolerance, a very controversial area. So I will open with a question. You all know that a preterm neonate is monitored for feeding intolerance by a number of measures. Some of us use abdominal girth. We could use that routinely or when the neonate has feeding intolerance. So we will discuss these aspects. Some of us are in the habit of using routinely aspirating pre-feed aspirates from the stomach, and this is used for assessing whether the neonate has feeding intolerance. Palpation and the feel of the abdomen, the presence of bowel sounds, all these are used for assessing the presence of feeding intolerance. So let me open by asking you, what parameters would you want to routinely monitor for assessing feed intolerance? And these are the 4 options. So please open the next poll, Mr. Sandeep. So would you want to use abdominal girth and pre-feed residuals routinely before every feeding? Which means, would you want to aspirate every feed? Before every feed, are you going to aspirate the OG tube? Or abdominal girth routinely and only measure pre-feed residuals if girth increases by more than 2 centimeters or a certain cutoff that you are going to prefix? Or would you not even measure girth routinely and you just say we measure girth at baseline and reassess whenever abdomen is clinically distended, and then on reassessment if girth increases by more than 2, only then you do pre-feed aspirates, or you do none of them at all ever?
Shall we close now?
So maybe we'll give 5 seconds because
this
is sort of daisy question. Yeah, we could close now.
Here comes the result.
Okay, so yeah, now again we seem to have a clear result here, although I see that the number of polling participants has come down a bit. I don't know whether lack of interest in feeding intolerance or because this is just a very controversial area. 70%, however, have gone for option 3, and yes, so let us discuss the current evidence as it stands, and we will come back to what probably is the best thing to do. Mind you that this is a very controversial area, and I'm not going to be able to tell that this is the best thing or the only right thing to do. There is no one right answer. However, there is a word of caution that routinely measuring gastric aspirates at least is definitely found to be at least more harmful than beneficial. And we have a Cochrane review with 2 small randomized controlled trials. One of them is from Suman Rao ma'am's unit from St. John's. And what they found is when someone routinely measures pre-feed gastric aspirates versus not routinely measuring pre-feed aspirates, you actually kind of increase the risk of feeding interruption by nearly 2 times. But there is absolutely no effect on NEC. So if you stop measuring pre-feed aspirates routinely to assess feeding intolerance, you are not going to increase the risk of NEC. However, you are probably going to reduce the chances of unwanted feeding interruptions by nearly 2 times. And doing routine feeding in aspirates might be associated with a number needed to harm of 3, which means if in 3 neonates we have the policy of routinely doing feeding aspiration, at least 1 neonate is likely to have an unwanted or unnecessary cessation of feeding. And we all understand that even 24 to 48 hours of interruption of enteral feeding is going to bring us back by multiple squares, and then we need to catch up with this lost time, and we are going to have to increase the exposure to central lines or intravenous fluids by many days. It also increases the time to establish full feeds by 4 days. So our feeding increments are going to definitely become more conservative, and all this is going to culminate in increased total parental nutrition days by 3.29 additional days of TPN if you routinely practice pre-feed aspirates. So again, what is the best thing that can be done? You know that each of these multiple parameters to assess feeding intolerance come with its own problems. Particularly gastric residuals have no meaning at volumes below 5 ml per kg of feeding. So in a 500 to 750 grammer, the normal amount of gastric aspirate itself is going to be 3 ml. It's going to be 4 ml in a neonate between 750 to 1000 grams. So when you are at a feeding volume of say 2 ml and you aspirate prior to the next feed and get 4 ml back, this may have absolutely no meaning. And in the contrary, it might result in unwanted interruption of feeding because you found that you had 200% pre-feed gastric residuals. So it is absolutely an evidence-based and a scientific practice to give up routine pre-feed aspirates as a measure to assess feeding intolerance. And when it comes to abdominal girth, again, a word of caution is most abdominal distension in preterm neonates also would be gaseous, related to CPAP and ventilation. An increase in girth by more than 2 centimeters is taken as significant, but it is not really clinically validated. The only thing which may be absolutely important is the presence of bilious vomiting, which may mean that we need to evaluate the neonate for conditions like NEC, obstruction, etc. Altered color of aspirates, particularly when it is reddish, that is fresh blood or altered blood. The presence of bilious aspirates is contentious and may not always necessarily indicate necrotizing enterocolitis, and this has to be correlated with a clinical assessment of the baby's abdomen. The other signs like occult blood or absent bowel sounds are very, very subjective. So in effect, this is a practical algorithm. So measure abdominal girth at the baseline, which means before you start feeding. And then as you feed the neonate, and whenever you find the neonate to have a clinically distended abdomen, then again measure abdominal girth. And if you see that it has increased by more than 2 centimeters, or if the neonate has persistent vomiting, then you might aspirate the stomach contents and again use a large volume syringe for aspiration, because the smaller volume syringes are associated with higher risk of mucosal injury. And if you find blood tinged aspirate, or if the baby has bilious vomiting, or if there are persistent bilious aspirates along with suspicious signs of NEC on palpation of the abdomen, then withhold feeds for 24 to 48 hours and assess the neonate with an X-ray or blood investigations for NEC, monitor the abdominal signs clinically. In conditions where the aspirate is only clear, if the volume is significant, that is more than 50% of the feed volume, you may have to withhold a few feeds, maybe for 4 to 6 hours with continued monitoring, but you may be able to restart feeding if the abdomen is clinically soft. And if the aspirate is clear and if the volume is less than 50% or less than 5 ml per kg, whichever is greater, push back the aspirate and just look for local causes. Recheck gastric residuals perhaps before the next feed, but continue with enteral feeding. So this is possibly the best thing to do when it comes to assessment of feeding intolerance. Now, the penultimate part of today's discussion is on multi-component fortification. I know we are running late. Mr. Kar, I'll probably take another 10 minutes.
Yeah. No issue, man. No problem.
Okay. So we have discussed about how we deal with feeding intolerance. And now we are going to discuss how are we going to meet the macro and micronutrient demands of preterm neonates, which we know are not entirely met only with breast milk or mother's own milk, even at maximal intakes. So why is this important? Why are we discussing about fortification? We all are aware that the ESPGHAN, the European Society of Pediatric Gastroenterology, Hepatology and Nutrition, they recommend that these are all the recommended intake of calorie, protein, fat, etc. These are the macronutrient intakes which are recommended. You can see in the second column. And in the last right column, you can see that even with maximum intake, that is 180 ml per kg of 145 unfortified breast milk, you are only able to reach maybe calorie and fat requirement, but the protein requirement is not at all met with even with maximal intake of breast milk. And when it comes to micronutrients, the picture is even more kind of disappointing, where even with maximal intake of only mother's own milk, although biologically and immunologically this is the best milk to give, we would not be able to meet the RDA of vitamin A, D, K, calcium, phosphorus, etc. And in fact, all micronutrient intakes except vitamin C and potassium are not going to be met by just giving breast milk, even when we give at the maximum intake, and hence the need for fortification. So this is our policy for human milk fortification. We as of now are using the bovine milk based powder form fortifier from one of the two commercially available, one of the three available preparations in India. We start fortification when the baby reaches 100 ml per kg per day of enteral feeding. Although there are at least 2 randomized controlled trials which have tried to add fortification at volumes earlier than 100 ml per kg per day without increasing the risk of NEC or feeding intolerance. But also there is not much of evidence to show that this translates into better in-hospital growth, such as better weight gain or length gain. But one could start or consider fortification at volumes between 50 to 80 ml per kg per day as well, as per the recent NNF guidelines. And in whom to fortify, again, you could start fortification from birth weights below 1800 grams. But the population that we are currently fortifying is restricted to very preterm neonates born below 32 weeks or very low birth weight neonates born below 1500 grams. So some more mature IUGR neonates may also be candidates for human milk fortification. We are using powder fortifier now at the rate of 1 gram per 25 ml of express breast milk, and we continue fortification until 37 weeks of post-menstrual age. So there is one more case scenario coming up now, and I'm going to ask you all to poll which you think is the best thing to do. So baby of Meena is 800 grammer, born at 27 weeks and has received CPAP and surfactant as well as TPN from day one. Currently, the neonate is 10 days old and has crossed birth weight. The baby is 820 grams and she is on 60 ml per kg per day of EBM. The abdomen is soft. What is your plan regarding fortification for this neonate? So would you like to start? We can open the poll, Mr. Sandeep. So would you like to increase feeding volume to 100? Would you like to start fortification right from 50 to 80 ml per kg per day, increase the feed volume to 150 ml per kg and only then fortify? Or would you not do fortification routinely? You will only wait for the neonate to reach full feeding with unfortified milk, wait for 3 to 4 days, and if only the baby is not having adequate weight gain on unfortified EBM, would you like to add fortification? So we have 10 seconds and I request you all to quickly choose the best option. Although I think I probably gave away a part of this answer already. So we could close the poll, Mr. Sandeep. We'll see what.
Yeah, I just closed it and I share the result.
Okay, so 52% for 100 ml per kg per day and 32% with 50 to 80 ml per kg. So I think most of you are with the recommendations of say AIMS protocol or the guideline which I just kind of shared what we do in our own unit. But I just shared with you that there are studies to show that earlier fortification is probably safer and is not associated with an increased risk of necrotizing enterocolitis or feeding intolerance, and translates into slightly higher macro and macronutrient intake, particularly calories and protein intake, when we start fortification right from volumes of 40 to 50 ml per kg per day. And the only hiccup has been that this has not really translated into better anthropometric gains, and it doesn't has really shown to be associated with better weight gain, length gain, etc. So I'll just show you this table, from the most updated Cochrane review on multi-component fortification, and you can see here that when compared to unfortified milk, mind you, this is not early versus late fortification or standard fortification. This is comparison of fortification versus no fortification. So providing fortified mother's milk itself was associated with 1.8 gram per kg per day higher weight gain, and similarly statistically significant better growth in terms of length as well as head growth, although this was not associated with better neurodevelopmental outcomes. But there were definitely short-term gains in the terms of short-term anthropometric gains, particularly weight, length, and head circumference. So you could always ask, what is the clinical significance of having just 1.8 gram per kg per day of better weight gain? But one must understand that for an ELBW neonate, over a period of 3 to 4 weeks, this will translate into almost 50 to 60 grams of better weight gain, and this has implications in terms of earlier discharge, better mineral bone density, lesser risk of late onset infections, etc., etc. And hence, it would be a good idea to have routine fortification as our policy. In fact, investigators are going one step forward, and we are now talking about individualized fortification, wherein we are talking about what we call as adjustable fortification, where twice weekly blood urea nitrogen levels are monitored in neonates, and the fortification is actually made more stronger or more concentrated. So in the place of just adding HMF, you might even consider adding a protein supplement, anything up to 1.2 grams per deciliter of human milk, if you find that BUN levels are persistently below 9 despite standard fortification. So the current brand of fortifiers, we have two brands which are more commonly used, and there is one more brand which is commonly used in the northern India. And you will find that at feeding volumes of 180 ml per kg of fortified milk, we are now able to meet most of the macro and micronutrient intake, with the only exception of maybe vitamin D, that too with one brand of fortifier, which alone you might have to supplement as a standalone supplement. So which answers the next question. So I think this we will not open as a poll. So the only nutrient which will actually remain deficient even after full fortification with a human milk fortifier, especially if you use one of the brands, would be vitamin D. So the important message I would like to reinforce is that after you add HMF, you would be able to supply most of the macro and the micronutrient demands of the baby. I briefly also would like to take your attention to this paper from AIMS Delhi recently, which is a non-inferiority randomized trial, which has actually tried to use preterm formula as a fortifier with expressed breast milk as compared to HMF. So instead of using human milk fortifier sachets, they try and saw whether adding preterm formula, again at the same strength, 1 gram per every 25 ml, was effective in achieving better growth. And they in fact found that there was no difference in the weight gain between the neonates who were fortified, whose mother's milk was fortified with preterm formula at 4 gram per 100 ml, when compared to the neonates whose mother's milk was fortified with human milk fortifier. In fact, fewer neonates in the preterm formula fortified group had feeding intolerance requiring cessation of feeding. So this is something which is now promising, and probably we will see more and more studies and data emerging about the safety as well as efficacy of using preterm formula itself as a fortifier solution. So as we already discussed, when in VLBW neonates, where we routinely fortify mother's own milk, most of the other needs, macro and micronutrient needs, including that of calcium, phosphorus, zinc, and iron, would be essentially met with HMF itself, and one might only have to do vitamin D supplementation additionally. And up to 5 years of age, the Indian Academy of Pediatrics recommends continuing 600 international units per day of vitamin D. Whereas in low birth weight neonates above 1500 grams, like between 1500 to 2500 grams, where we do not routinely fortify, there is some role or benefit of supplementing both vitamin D as well as iron. Vitamin D right from birth at 400 to 800 international units per day, and iron is added from 4 weeks of age and continued until 1 to 2 years of age. So the slides are again on supplements. I'll just skip through them. So I will be finishing with the last segment, which will be on probiotics, and I think this is something which has generated a lot of interest in the recent past. So quickly, I would like to understand from you, what do you think, in your opinion, is the most appropriate response about probiotics? The options are in front of you. We can open. This is the last poll for the presentation. Mr. Sandeep?
Yeah, I have launched the poll.
Yes. So do probiotics reduce NEC and not sepsis? Option 2, they reduce NEC, sepsis and mortality. Option 3, they reduce NEC in formula-fed neonates and it's more useful in high-income countries. Not so useful in low-middle-income countries like ours, where breast milk feeding rates are higher. And option 4, probiotics reduce NEC but increase sepsis. So we'll close the poll because we are running late.
Yeah, I'm ending the poll.
Okay.
And I share the result.
Okay. 76% of you have are well updated with evidence, and you have rightly taken option 2, which is probiotics are associated with lesser NEC, sepsis, and mortality. Yes. So previous systematic reviews which concluded that probiotic use in preterm VLBW neonates was associated with reduction in necrotizing enterocolitis and all-cause mortality had not still demonstrated reduction or any association with late-onset sepsis. But the more updated randomized the meta-analysis from 30 RCTs, which was published in 2017, has found that the use of probiotics is not only associated with reduction in severe grade of NEC, mortality, but also reduction in late onset sepsis by 12%. And the same is also true for low middle income countries, as found in this systematic review published in 2017 pertaining to low middle income countries. So again, you can see that late onset sepsis, mortality, and NEC stage 2 and higher, all lesser with the use of probiotic supplementation. So NEC lower to 3.1% in the probiotic supplemented group versus 7% in the control group. We have also a recently published meta-analysis of only the Indian trials, which has been published recently in IJP 2020 by Dr. Hari Balakrishna from Surya, Mumbai. And the study also concludes similar findings from the Indian context, that supplementation of preterm VLBW neonates with probiotics is associated with nearly 64% lesser incidence in NEC and similar reductions in mortality and sepsis. In fact, sepsis is lower by more than what we saw in the data from the high income countries. Sepsis is lowered by almost 44%, probably because of the higher risk of sepsis in the setups like ours. And also the time to reach full feeds and time to discharge was lower in the probiotic supplemented groups. Now, when it comes to the recommendations on probiotics, so we all have now clear-cut guidelines to say that probiotics, yes, are beneficial and associated with lower NEC, sepsis, mortality. The question really here now is which probiotic to use, what is the dose, what is the combination, should it be single strain, multiple strains, etc. So there are a number of critical factors, starting from the dose, the host interaction, how probiotics are to be stored, how cold chain is to be maintained, and having close quality controls. And there is this beautiful article published by Girish Deshpande's group in 2011, which has given some clear clinical guidelines for the use of probiotics. And they recommend that if a single organism has to be used, it must be bifidobacteria, because they appear to be more effective in colonizing the gut than lactobacilli. And both of these are more effective than Saccharomyces. Among bifidobacteria, there is a lot of data on Bifidobacterium brevi M16V, particularly from the Australian group by Dr. Sanjay Patole's team. And they have shown that, again, as a single strain, this might be associated with lower NEC, sepsis, and mortality. And these are the recommendations from Girish Deshpande's group. They recommend that if you use a combination, then it should contain at least one strain of Lactobacillus and at least one Bifidobacterium. A dose of 3 to the 3 billion organisms, or 3 into 10 to the power of 9 organisms per day, preferably in a single dose, might be the optimal dose to use in the more mature neonates, and 1.5 billion organisms might be the optimal dose among ELBW neonates. And the neonate can be started on probiotics whenever he or she is ready for enteral feeding, preferably within the first 7 days of life, and should be continued until 35 weeks of post-conceptional age. So with that, I will end with the last area, which is how to feed a neonate with AREDF, which I told earlier that I will be coming back to. So the largest study in this area has been the ADEPT trial, which is the abnormal Doppler enteral prescription trial, which compared initiating feeding at 24 hours versus 4 to 5 days in neonates born below 35 weeks with umbilical Doppler abnormalities like cerebral redistribution or reduced umbilical artery diastolic flows. And what they found was, when you began feeding even early at 24 hours, there was absolutely no increase in the risk of NEC, even in the neonates with abnormal Dopplers. They enrolled a total of 404 neonates. And you can see in this Kaplan-Meier curve shown here, the blue line represents the neonates who were given early feeding, and the red line represents neonates who were initiated on late feeding. You can see that the time to reach full feeding was much more earlier, around 3 days of difference, 3 days earlier in the neonates who were begun on enteral feeding early, between 24 to 48 hours of age. And of course, it is associated with lesser parental nutrition days and need for high dependency care. So I conclude with the following take-home messages. My apologies for overshooting time. So I leave these, concluding messages on your screen. And since we have already, overshot the time, I hand over back to Mr. Sandeep Kar for the Q&A session.
Yeah, madam. Thank you. I think all the audience are eagerly waiting. A lot of questions have been posted. Now, in that, I would just stop your screen sharing and I will go back to the screen sharing of mine. Give me a minute for that. Second for that. Yeah, madam. We will go to the Q&A part. Can you take a look at the Q&A in your screen?
Yeah.
Madam, I think you will find the number of questions have been posted.
Yes. So we have 6 questions as of now. Shall we take them up one by one?
Yeah. Please, ma'am.
Right. So Dr. Sundeep Nigam has asked, if a neonate maintains weight on 60 ml per kg, should we increase IV fluids in the coming days, or only if there is a significant fall in weight of more than 5%? I think this question is more in connection with the fluid management. Yes. So the decision for deciding the fluid intake on each day, as you rightly said, depends upon number of factors, including the weight gain, weight loss, the urine output, wherever feasible urine specific gravity, and wherever feasible serum electrolytes such as sodium. So as you rightly said, the decision to increase feeding should not be blindly undertaken based on a certain kind of protocol, but it has to be individualized based on the neonate's clinical appearance, presence of edema, presence of dehydration, percentage weight loss, etc. So if your neonate has already had abnormal weight gain, so it might be a good idea to not increase fluids. Next question also from him, can HMF be started in all babies less than 2 kg? So if you look at the population of neonates enrolled in human milk fortification trials, majority of the trials in the Cochrane review have stuck to neonates less than 1500 grams. a couple of studies have extended this bar until neonates less than 1800 grams and up to less than 2000 grams. But the issue that must be remembered here is, a number of babies, particularly between 1500 or maybe 1600 to 2000 grams, will be actually eligible to take breastfeeding completely. So even giving HMF will mandate that you have to give them expressed breast milk. So this itself will become practically difficult in these babies. And then the usefulness of HMF or human milk fortification is again kind of more dubious in this category. So HMF definitely below 1500 grams and below 32 weeks. Now, if you find a baby, say between 1500 to 1800 grams, especially if the neonate is not achieving appropriate weight gain, then you can consider HMF. But I don't think you should routinely fortify every neonate born less than 2 kg. Okay, next question, how many sachets to be given daily? I assume you're asking about HMF. HMF, the dilution depends upon the EBM that you're giving. So it should be added in every feeding at the ratio of 1 gram of the powder to 25 ml. So right now the manufacturers are recommending 1 gram to every 25 ml, which will be 4 gram to 100 ml. So there is no such thing like sachets in number of day. In every feeding EBM feed that is being given, you calculate accordingly. So if it has to be 1 gram per every 25 ml. So if the feeding volume is 12 ml per feed, you must be adding 0.5 gram of sachet of HMF per feed. So one more precaution, word of caution here is you cannot keep HMF fortified EBM for a long time because there are concerns with osmolality and other things. So always freshly prepare HMF by mixing it to EBM for that feed. So you may have to add, if you're giving 12 ml feeding, add half sachet of the HMF to that feeding. Now, use of prebiotics in premature babies. Okay, this is again a controversial area. So there is more unclear evidence about prebiotics as compared to probiotics. So probiotics, there is definitely evidence. We showed you the evidence that it reduces necrotizing enterocolitis and sepsis. With prebiotics, it is more debatable. I wouldn't say as of now it should be done routinely. Okay, which is better to be used to prepare formula, RO water or bottled distillery water or sterile water in plastic rescued or any safe drinking water. So this is again based on your convenience. In our unit, we started using the packaged mineral water for preparing formula because we had concerns with contamination with the filter water and RO water. But I leave it to the convenience of your unit and your nurses to decide this. There is no such hard and fast recommendation. Obviously, it must be safe and clean drinking water. Any specific probiotic strain to be used in premature babies? So I think we did discuss about probiotic strain. When you are considering an individual strain, Bifidobacterium has multiple advantages over the other bacteria, particularly over Lactobacilli and Saccharomyces. So there is particularly a lot of data coming in about Bifidobacterium breve M16B. In fact, Tablets has their own product, and I can see Mr. Sandeep must be happy that this question has come up. They have asked the probiotic strain to be used in premature neonates. Having said that, multi-strain combinations are also available in India. So let me not go into individual product brands because that would involve conflicts of interest. So if you ask me strain, I would say Bifidobacterium first, followed by Lactobacillus. Now, Dr. Prasad Rao, why HMF should be mixed only in breast milk and not in formula milk? Because it is not necessary. If you see breast milk, the calorie content of 100 ml is 67 cals. Probably it would be 65 cals in 100 ml. So even if you give 180 ml per kg per day of enteral feeding, you will only be giving 120 cals per kg. Whereas preterm formula contains anything between 78 to 82 cals per every 100 ml of prepared formula. So if when you give 180 or 200 ml per kg, you are already giving 150 to 160 calories per kg. And similarly, you would also be giving a relatively higher protein intake. The preterm formula contains close to 2.4 gram per deciliter of prepared formula. And hence, when you're giving intake of say 180 ml per kg per day of preterm formula, exclusive formula fed baby, the baby would be on a good dose of protein. So you don't need to add any HMF, right? So it is only with EBM that there is a need to fortify. Okay, which is better, term donor milk or preterm formula milk? Term donor milk versus preterm formula milk. Okay, definitely, as you all saw, there is no such comparison between term donor milk, and I don't know whether you meant term or preterm donor milk. So obviously, any donor milk is better than formula milk. There is absolutely no question. Human milk is better than formula milk. Now, if your question was among donor milk, which is better, term or preterm, I don't think we really have the choice when it comes to donor milk. Either from breast milk banking or from commercially available donor milk, which is now being widely used. I don't think we have the choice to choose preterm or term milk. But obviously, preterm donor human milk has physiologically slightly higher levels of protein content than the term donor milk, especially in the first 2 to 4 weeks of postnatal age. Of course, this difference becomes blunted with increasing level of postnatal age. So there is no doubt that donor milk, whatever milk it is better than formula milk. How long to give HMF? Until 37 weeks of PCA or until 2000 grams is what is recommended. But sometimes baby starts just taking exclusive breastfeeding and you may not be able to actually continue HMF or even earlier than that. Now, Dr. Sudhakar, what is your unit policy regarding baby born to HIV positive mother? With regards to feeding in HIV positive mothers, we follow the existing WHO and the NACO guidelines. So exclusive breastfeeding is still safe and it is an option, and we give the choices to the parents, and we explain the benefits versus the risk of an approach of exclusive breastfeeding versus exclusive replacement feeding, and we go by the choice of the family. Next question, Dr. Aarti Gupta, which micronutrient should be given along with HMF? So as we discussed, the only supplement that you would need in VLBW neonates who are receiving fortified EBM, complete fortified breast milk, the only supplement which would be required is vitamin D, and that too if you're using one of the two brands. I have not mentioned the names of the brand again for conflicts of interest. With the other brand, you don't even have to supplement vitamin D. But remember that once you stop HMF, you will still have to supplement iron until 1 to 2 years of age. And you will have to continue supplementing vitamin D until even, until 1 year, we supplement 400 international units per day. Beyond 1 year, it is difficult to continue supplementation, but IAP recommends 600 international units daily. The need for calcium and phosphorus as well as multivitamin supplementation is no longer there when you give HMF fortified EBM. What is your take on elemental formula if feeding intolerance is present, Dr. Bharat? So again, this is a huge issue. I think the choice of elemental formula must be guided by a clear indication. Now, are you dealing with short bowel syndrome following NEC or NEC surgery? Are you dealing with suspected cow milk protein allergy or intolerance? Are you dealing with conditions such as FPIES, right, food protein induced enterocolitis? So do you have a clear-cut indication? So these are conditions, especially FPIES and CMPA, are going to manifest with abdominal distension, blood in stools, diarrhea, emesis, repeated episodes repeatedly on introducing either breast milk or cow milk protein containing formula. Now, if this is the manifestation, you are repeatedly encountering with this problem every time, and it is only dealt with on eliminating cow milk protein, then it makes sense. But I think this should not be used vaguely or routinely in every baby with suspected feeding intolerance. How long will you give preterm formula to a preterm neonate? The weight cutoff recommended by the previous, I think, NLF guideline was 2.5 kg. Although I am not really sure in the current 2020 guidelines what is their take on this, but if a neonate is on preterm formula for some reason, preterm neonate, then we generally switch to standard formula after 2.5 kgs. Dr. Sundeep Nigam again, is there a possibility of transmission of COVID through clothes of a corona positive mother? Technically, yes, COVID can spread through fomites. There is absolutely no evidence of transmission through breast milk. but a good breast hygiene and hand hygiene is recommended before continuation of breastfeeding in a COVID-19 positive mother when she is continuing breastfeeding. Should we start vitamin D supplementation from day one, even in moderately stable babies? Yes, you could absolutely start vitamin D supplementation from day one in stable neonates, provided they are on full feeding and they have crossed enteral intake of 100 ml per kg per day of feeding. I think these are all the questions.
Madam, thank you so much. I think all the questions have been taken by you one by one. I'm sure all the viewers must be happy that all their questions have been addressed. So, Madam, I think the time has come to after the question answer, we have one shot that every time we say that feedback is important. Your feedback is important, and that is the reason here I open the final poll. I think that is because as there are so many polls there earlier, right? We have not given a final poll here. In fact, tomorrow I will send a mail to all the attendees. I mean, who have attended. They can give their feedback on that. Madam, I must thank you for your excellent presentation, which has covered all the points. I'm sure the audience who have attended must be extremely happy, and all their questions have been answered also. Madam, on behalf of Tablets India, I thank you for sparing your valuable time, and all the guests who have put their time. I think we really value your time, and I'm sure this web talk has certainly added more value to your clinical practice. We at Tablets India are dedicated to serve you more efficiently and look forward to your continued support in the days to come. With that, Madam, thank you so much for being a part of today's web talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr.
I'm sure the audience must have liked it. I think the questions and the feedback is also indicating. So the guests, all the audience, whoever have joined, please stay safe, stay healthy, and thank you very much for joining this web talk. Thank you, madam. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, take care, please. Thank you.